All right, we got another solo podcast coming in. Been a little while since I did one of these, but something I've been thinking about a lot is all the different skills that make up the bigger picture skill of coaching. So I wanted to break this down in some detail since I've been thinking about it a lot in terms of improving my own coaching, as well as improving the ability of our coaches to coach at South Loop Strength and Conditioning and with Legion. So really breaking apart these different pieces and understanding when to work on certain things and how to impart these skills to other people is really, really difficult, super hard. So I thought that there were at least some insights that I've had over this time as far as breaking down coaching into a few actionable pieces and understanding how to think about that process. So I figured I'd ramble on a microphone for a little while and send that out to you guys. Let me know what you think. Something I've been thinking about a lot recently has to do with the many skills that make up good coaching. This is something that's come up a lot in our coaches meetings at South Loop Strength and Conditioning, where we're, trying to help our coaches be able to execute, the best class possible and to be able to give people a lot of individual insight into their movement, to be able to manage class logistics, to be able to understand, how hard to push people in various situations, to understand how much they can expect to get out of an individual in a given class period, to understand when it's appropriate to tell someone to do more, when it's appropriate to tell someone to do less, how much of a stickler you should be about form on certain exercises, all that kind of stuff. So all of these different pieces are pretty complicated, and a field like coaching has so many different skills that go into it that sometimes it's difficult to actually parse out what's going on and what needs to be improved for an individual to become a better coach. So in the process of thinking about this, I've sort of come to think of this as the micro skills of coaching, right? That people think of, oh, that person's a good coach, that person's a bad coach, I don't like their personality, I don't get along with them, etc. But the reality is that we're looking at something that has potentially dozens of different facets of different skills, and if any of those facets is out of alignment with the others, you can end up with someone who may not be coaching up to their potential, or for a specific individual, say in a class or receiving coaching, if they are particularly sensitive to one area or may need focus on one area, they can end up finding a coach to be a bad coach, quote unquote, and that coach may not be a bad coach overall. It may just be that they're sort of out of alignment with that person in one area. So really thinking about these different concepts and trying to articulate them and to help coaches sort of self-assess where they may potentially need work is something that I think is really, really important for what we're doing in terms of trying to improve the coaching quality in our facility. But I mean, across, the industry as a whole of people who consider themselves coaches or in sort of ancillary fields, right? I mean, any sort of situation where you're working with individuals to try to get them better is going to have a lot of similarities in terms of understanding the various aspects of working with individuals on an emotional level, understanding the actual nuts and bolts of your chosen field, and being able to assess and diagnose problems, and then to act appropriately relative to that diagnosis. So in terms of the micro skills of coaching in fitness in particular, I think that some of the stuff that most people think of as coaching is sort of like seeing movement flaws, understanding how to correct those flaws, and having sort of a framework for the different drills and corrections and cues and all that sort of stuff that you can utilize to improve someone's movement. So I would consider this stuff to essentially be table stakes, right? This is the equivalent of, if you want to be a computer programmer, you better actually understand the language that you are intending to write in, right? If you want to be a doctor, you better have gone through medical school and have an understanding of differential diagnosis and all that kind of stuff. That there's sort of this table stakes knowledge level and skill level that is important and necessary to be able to coach, period. So we can sort of break this up into a few different categories. So I think one of them is seeing movement. So this is something that is touched on heavily in a lot of different certification processes and all that kind of stuff. And essentially what we're looking for here is, if you are watching someone move, can you see what is going on? Can you see that there is a flaw? Can you see what is potentially the most important flaw? And can you see, the various aspects of the chain where something is potentially not going exactly as you would like? And I think that essentially what this skill is about is having an idealized version of a movement pattern in your head, and then being able to compare what you're seeing to that idealized version. So if you take something like a squat, there's all the sort of standard points of performance. We generally want to see the hip crease pass below the knee. We want to see an upright torso in the bottom. We want to see the feet stay flat on the ground, not too much, rocking onto the heels not coming up. We want to see the knees tracking over the toes, all that sort of stuff. We generally have an image in our heads of what an ideal squat may look like. And obviously this can change for an individual based upon their anthropometrics, limb length, all that sort of stuff. So we have this idealized version, and then we watch someone squat in real life, and we're essentially comparing the image of what their squat looks like to our idealized version. So I think coaches who are, pretty good, but not necessarily top level coaches, are generally able to see when something is wrong. They can see, okay, my ideal squat looks like this in my head, and this person is doing something different. And they may be able to sort of point out individual areas where something is not quite right. Oh, it looks like the heels are coming up. It looks like they're dropping their chest forward. It looks like their knees are collapsing, all that sort of thing. So essentially, just being able to even recognize that there is a problem is one of the, most fundamental skills of coaching. Then on top of that, we not only need to be able to see that there's a problem, we need to be able to sort of understand the cascading effects of other problems. So if we sort of stick to a squat, since that's a very common movement that a lot of people are attempting to coach, there's all kinds of common flaws, which I just mentioned. And something that can end up happening is that a coach can see a certain flaw and then focus in on it without understanding that that flaw is actually downstream from a bunch of other ones, or is potentially a compensation pattern developed by that athlete to get through the movement based upon what they understand the requirements of the movement to be, but they're really trying to work around some other issues. So one of the most common things that I see in terms of coaches making errors as far as this goes has to do with, this is going to be a little bit difficult to explain in an audio format, but, we'll run through it. We'll see what happens. So essentially, if an athlete tends to hyperextend their lower back, arching excessively, right, sort of sticking their butt way out, they can end up reducing their ability to actually drop into full hip flexion, so the ability to get all the way down into a squat, because the pelvis is tilted too much, and then they're creating a situation where they actually impinge in the front of the hip as they try to drop down into the bottom of the squat. So what ends up happening there, right, if you are missing hip flexion based upon excessive lumbar extension and rotating of the pelvis, you'll end up doing all kinds of crazy stuff because you as an athlete understand, okay, I need to go all the way down, and you get this sort of pinching feeling in the front of your hip. So what do people start doing? Well, there's any number of compensations that they can do. Some of the most common ones are doing strange stuff with their stance, right? They'll actually move their feet kind of all over the place, potentially very wide, to try to get out of this impingy position in the front of their hip. They'll actually start rounding their back and getting a butt wink in the bottom, because if you run out of hip flexion, right, the ability to sort of drop into the hip to go down in a squat, what are your other options? Well, one of them is certainly to round the lower back. So as soon as they hit the point where they're out of hip flexion, that pelvis will sort of reverse aggressively rather than being kind of, driven into anterior tilt. It will flip back the other way, and you'll get some rounding in that lower back. You also see a lot of torso compensation. So particularly in potentially hypermobile individuals who often default into an extreme extension strategy, as they drop down, they'll run into that restriction, and then they'll try to get lower. And the way that they do that is they keep pushing the hips backward. And then in order to not fall forward, right, since they can't really keep their hips underneath their shoulders, they kind of round their upper back and throw their torso forward so that they're not tipping over backwards. So again, a little bit abstract potentially to describe that rather than see it, but this is a pattern that is existing in every gym that is currently open for business as you're listening to this by a good percentage of the people who are squatting. So what ends up happening there is that you have an issue of lumbar hyperextension, which may not be super obvious to someone who isn't trained to see it, right? Especially since we're often told to watch out for back rounding. But this lumbar hyperextension actually results in potentially, 5, 6, 7, 8 other flaws down the chain that are much more obvious. It's much more obvious to notice someone rounding their back in the bottom. It's much more obvious to notice someone doing kind of weird stuff with their feet and knees to try to get all the way down. It's much more obvious to notice a chest collapsing forward. But if you don't kind of have the framework to understand how one flaw can actually relate to another one, then you may be ending up focusing on really trying to get this person to stop rounding their back in the bottom without understanding that back rounding actually comes from excessive extension up top. So, you're essentially, you're barking up the wrong tree, to use a popular expression, right? And there's just no way you're ever going to fix that lumbar rounding in the bottom of the squat if you don't actually fix the initial position the athlete is in. So Seeing has the basic characteristic of being able to understand when something is not right relative to an ideal, and then it has the more advanced characteristic of being able to understand what order flaws should potentially be addressed in, simply because the flaw that you're seeing may not be the actual flaw that is causing the problem. And coaches who are, more advanced in this capacity may not always have that sort of guru-like insight to be like, oh, well, it looks like this is happening, but really I've seen this 1,000 times, and then this is what's really happening. And that skill does come, right? If you've seen the same pattern enough times, the example of the squat one is a great one. Another one is people who have a hard time reaching their arms overhead, right? It may look like they're doing weird lumbar hyperextension to get overhead. They have a hard time actually getting their arms back. They sort of dive their head forward rather than being able to keep their neck neutral to reach overhead. And oftentimes what they're doing, again, particularly in people who are hypermobile, is that they're often just not moving the scapula on the rib cage, which can cause these other downstream effects. So, over time, you do start to recognize these global patterns, so you can pick them out and start, hopefully with that more one shot, one kill type of a assessment process of someone's movement. But the reality is that great coaches don't always have that deep level of sort of, precision insight. What ends up happening instead is that they understand this concept that the flaw that they're seeing may not be the flaw that they need to correct. So what they do is they try something and they see if it works. And if that's not getting them the results that they want, they quickly think to themselves, you know what, this doesn't seem to be working. Maybe I'm addressing a compensation pattern that is downstream of the actual flaw that I'm concerned with. And then they can zoom out from the thing that they're working on and assess the movement again as a whole to see if there's somewhere else that may need work. And any good coach is constantly doing this, whether or not they recognize that that's the skill that they're actually putting into place. So with seeing, there's the basic level of, can you see that movement flaws exist? And then there's the more advanced level of, can you actually assess what you're seeing and understand where the highest leverage point is to try to change that athlete's movement. So once we have the seeing aspect in place, then what do we try to do with it? Well, once you see an issue, you try to correct it. Again, this is sort of the fundamentals of what people think of as coaching is, okay, I'm in potentially a group CrossFit class or a personal training session or something like that, and I'm squatting, something's going wrong. My coach says, hey, why don't you try keeping your knees out? And then I keep my knees out, I set a personal record, everything feels good, great coach, great day. So this correcting process is essentially seeing the flaw, then understanding how to communicate to that athlete what the flaw is, and allow them to take action on it. So something that we often see with coaches, particularly those who are more analytical or love continuing education, all that kind of stuff, is that they'll give athletes potentially confusing, complicated cues in an attempt to get them to move perfectly in a way that doesn't actually facilitate the athlete making a change. So good coaches have a lot of different sort of tactics for improving movement, right? This is stuff that is covered in a lot of other certifications. There's the simple verbal cue of, hey, keep your knees out. There's a tactile cue of putting your hand against an athlete's knee and having them push out against it as they squat so that they don't let the knee collapse. It's demonstrating to the athlete, hey, when you squat, you go like this, and sort of driving your knees in the bottom of the squat. And what I want you to do is squat like this, where you sort of demonstrate a proper squat where the knees track in line with the toes. There's all these little bits of tools and tactics to communicate to an athlete what you want to see from them. And one of the best ways to do this is by giving the athlete a concrete action to take. It's usually better to give them an actionable item of push your knees out, push your foot into the ground, drive your heels into the ground, make sure that you feel connection between your foot and the ground, activate your armpit as you reach overhead, push against me in this position, don't let me do this to you as you push their knee in. All that kind of stuff gives them a much clearer action that they can take, and then they can hopefully feel the difference as they're, going through their movement process. The other aspect here that I think is really important for correcting, just like with the seeing process, is having a bunch of different tools in your toolbox and being willing to sort of throw things at the wall until you get something that sticks. So it's not just about having a specific cues for a specific movement, right? This is something that we see a lot with athletes who have come in, who have been coached before, maybe by a coach without as much sophistication, where the cue for deadlift is don't round your back. The cue for squat is knees out. So independent of what the athlete is doing, the coach sort of throws the same cues at them over and over and over again, which can result in hyper exaggerated movement patterns where athletes who already have their knees tracking in line fine with their toes and are really trying to throw their knees out as far as possible, right? Athletes who have a fine neutral spine position on a deadlift are told to arch their back repeatedly and to not let it round so that they end up dramatically hyperextended way beyond the point of proper stability for the movement that they're doing at that time. So correcting is about having the right cue for the athlete at that time, which means that you may give them a cue and you're probably not going to get the response that you hope the first time. Again, good coaches sort of have an intuition for which cue is going to be most effective, but a lot of the time you simply have this disparity between what you're seeing and what you want to see, and you're trying different stuff to get it to stick. You're going to say, okay, I'm going to push against their knee, I'm going to see what happens. Didn't quite work. You know what, maybe I'm going to try pushing against their foot to see if I can get them to activate in the foot, which may help them track their knee better. Okay, that's a little bit better, but not totally perfect. I'm just going to show them. Maybe they don't understand what their body is doing in space relative to what I want it to do. So I'm going to squat. Look, what you're doing looks like this. I want you to make it look like this. Then you may end up actually able to fix that athlete's position, or you may have to film them. That's another great tool, especially with the omnipresence of cell phones. So you can actually film what the athlete is doing and show it back to them. Because again, a lot of the time that people are having a really hard time with movement, there's simply a huge disconnect between what they feel their body doing and what their body is actually doing. So this correcting process is about having a lot of different tools, a lot of different ways of understanding how to get someone to move more like what you want them to move, and then being able to iteratively run through the process of throwing a cue at them until you start to see progress in the direction that you think is appropriate for that athlete at that time. So the seeing and correcting stuff, again, that's table stakes. There's dramatic differences in coaches in terms of their ability to actually process this information, see global patterns, and get the right thing at the right time. But this is the sort of nuts and bolts of coaching that almost anyone who's a coach needs to have a pretty solid understanding of these skills in order to get proper movement from people and to create buy-in and trust amongst the athletes who they're working with. So once we sort of have this baseline table stakes level of seeing and correcting, then the most important stuff becomes prioritizing, right? So this is something that we sort of started to touch on when we discussed the difference between, just seeing that there's generally a movement going not quite right versus seeing a larger pattern of where a correction can be applied to potentially fix some downstream effects. So when we're actually prioritizing what we're seeing and what we're working on, this is something that's really, really important, particularly for complicated movements and for athletes who may be overthinking or overwhelmed by what they're trying to work on. So if we take a potentially complicated movement like, let's say, a snatch or a clean or a jerk where there's a lot of moving pieces for an athlete, right? They have to understand where they're starting. They have to understand where they're going to receive the bar. They have to understand the hip and leg mechanics. They have to understand how to get their arms overhead. All this kind of stuff is happening at once for an athlete. And it's really easy for them, particularly those who tend to be overly analytical relative to their own movement process. They can just get overwhelmed, and you can kind of see the gears turning in their head as they're trying to move. And one of the most important things for a coach to understand is where to prioritize your time and your cueing relative to that athlete. So with the seeing and correcting process, one of the things that I like to think about is what is an easy win and what is a difficult win. So something that's an easy win is a part of the movement that is not necessarily during a dynamic portion, right? So say we're dealing with a clean. It's difficult to get someone to properly extend the hips and legs vertically, to not launch the bar out in front, and to receive in a proper, let's say, power clean position in a quarter squat with a good rack position. There's a lot happening there. It's dynamic, and they can't necessarily think about all the steps of what they're doing as they're doing it. However, the starting position is often something that's relatively easy to fix compared to the dynamic motion of them actually doing the clean. So low-hanging fruit is something like starting position. If someone's starting position is screwed up, you can have them get into the starting position, then make whatever tweaks you need to make. Hey, I need you to actually widen your feet out. I need you to bring your feet narrower. I need you to widen your grip out. I want you to raise your hips up slightly. I want you to make sure that this bar is lined up over your foot right here. All of these little tweaks can happen in this starting position without them having to actually do a dynamic movement. So relatively low hanging fruit there, because you can kind of have them hang out in that spot and just fix everything until they feel the correct position, then have them attempt to establish that position again on their own over and over and over again until it kind of makes sense to them. So in terms of prioritizing what we're working on, low-hanging fruit is often something that is worth doing, even if it's not necessarily the most egregious flaw in that athlete's movement, simply because it gives them a quick win, right? So when you're dealing with athletes, particularly those who may be new or stressed out or overly analytical, that quick wins are huge for them, because it makes them feel like they're making progress, and it can get them in touch with the process of, hey, what you're doing isn't quite right. Try these few things, see how it feels, and if it's better for you, then we'll build on that. So quick wins ingrain this process in them, and then it can help them understand how to correct more complicated pieces down the line. So in terms of prioritizing, I like to start with quick wins whenever they're available, but sometimes too, we have a lot of different flaws going on. So let's stick with the example of the clean, where if you're watching the movement, you might see a bunch of stuff happening. Their starting position is a little bit screwed up. They rush the bar around the knees. They bend the arms early. They launch the bar super low off of their thigh. It loops way out in front, and then they catch with their hips not in a properly flexed position, but kind of driving forward, so their torso is leaning back to receive the bar. And this is super, super common. Again, in any gym where cleans are happening, there's probably a high percentage of members doing this right this moment, and the coach is sort of like, they can tell something's wrong, but they're really not sure where to begin with it. So a higher order coach is going to be able to understand where this movement may be going wrong, and then they're also going to be able to understand how much leverage they're going to have to change that movement in a specific moment. So that may be something like understanding where we have a technique issue and where we have a compensation issue. So the example we talked about with the squat earlier is kind of an interesting hybrid of those two concepts. So we can circle back to that, and we'll look at someone who's squatting with excessive arching in their lower back. And is this a technique issue or is this a compensation issue? A technique issue is something that I would say is more like, they simply don't understand what the right way to do the movement is, and they're trying to do it in a way that makes sense to them, but may not be quote unquote correct. So if we look at someone squatting with too much arch on their back and it's a technique issue, that could be as simple as, hey, when you squat, I notice that you arch your back an awful lot. Are you trying to do that on purpose? And someone may say, in fact, yes, I am, because they've read a book somewhere about how they need to maintain a tight lumbar arch. They've been coached repeatedly by some other coach or trainer to not let their back round under any circumstance and to arch to find stability. All those sorts of things are pretty common. And in that case, it may actually be relatively simple to fix that person's positioning. All you may have to do is say, hey, listen, what I want you to try is arching a little bit less, and I want you to feel like you're moving through your hips as you drive down, and you can sort of give them some tactile cueing right there to make sure they understand what it feels like. And in the bottom position, you should end up here. And if someone doesn't have major compensation patterns relative to that back arching, it may be as simple as that. All you have to do is say, listen, you're trying to do it this way. I want you to do it this way instead. And in that case, it can be sort of like a magical fix for them. On the Olympic lifting, for example, that's another area where there's often just major technique flaws going on. Someone is trying to do a clean like we talked about earlier. They rush the lift off the floor. They whip it around their knees and kind of slam the bar into their quads and launch it way out in front. Well, in that case, again, it may be relatively simple to say to them, hey, listen, what I need you to do is slow down off the floor so you can feel the bar actually come back. And this is more difficult potentially than some other areas to fix, but there's just a misunderstanding on their part of what the movement should actually feel like. And if we can get that cleaned up, then everything else down the line may be much, much cleaner, simply because there was a technical issue throwing everything else off. But when we start dealing with compensation, it gets a lot more complicated. So if we circle back to the squat example, we may have someone who's arching so much in their low back to stabilize because they have no idea how to actually engage the front of their core, right? Other than their rectus abdominis. So they kind of have this corset muscle kind of, pulling all of their abdominal musculature in. They're not getting any proper expansion of their abdomen when they breathe. They have no activation of obliques on the side, and the lumbar curve is super exaggerated because the erectors are kind of dialed to 10. In this case, it's not simply enough to say, hey, listen, when you squat, I want you to arch your back less. It's going to be way more complicated because they fundamentally don't have the proper strategy for breathing and bracing. And they may also potentially have hip anatomy issues that put them in a position that's more likely to create impingement. So in this case, some of their other movement patterns are potentially compensating around that impingement in the front of the hip. So in this compensation pattern, it's a lot more complicated. This is not something that's just going to be like, hey, arch your back less. Hey, push your knees out a little bit more. This is something that is going to require way more detailed work from a coach, and often work from that individual with a physical therapist or some other movement professional to actually clean up their fundamental strategies for movement. So as a coach, potentially in a group class or a personal training setting, you may not realistically fix someone's issues if they're working around significant compensation patterns. This is something that can be completely outside of the scope of practice for you as a trainer. And it may also be something that requires hours and hours and hours of work to fundamentally retrain a pattern, or to, reposition a joint relative to another joint so that they can actually get good movement patterning. So top level coaches can recognize when they're dealing with something that is a compensation issue versus something that is a technique issue. And they can also understand realistically how much change they're going to make in a given amount of time, right? So especially folks coaching group classes, it may be one of those things where you have 15 minutes to work on, let's say, back squatting for a day, and that you're not going to be able to absolutely fix everybody's movement in that time frame. You can give people stuff to work on. You can give them some things to think about. You can make a referral or a recommendation out to a physical therapist, but you may not be able to actually get the type of progress that you want in that time frame. And it's okay to recognize what you're going to be able to realistically do. And in fact, it's almost imperative to, because just like with the movement pattern seeing issue that we talked about earlier, you need to have a vision in your head of what you want to see from someone, but you also need to have a realistic vision of how they're going to get there, right? You should understand what type of progress can I make with this individual in 1 day, in 1 minute, in 1 month, in 3 months, all that sort of thing. It's the same type of thing that you go through coaching someone, let's say to improve their max back squat or to improve their 1 mile run time. You take an assessment of where they're at, and great coaches understand what type of trajectory of improvement they're going to see, right? With someone who's new, you can expect to see quite a bit of improvement on a back squat. You may expect them to potentially improve by 20, 30, 40 pounds over just a few months from getting used to the movement, from understanding the technique of it, and simply from linear progression on that movement. Whereas someone who's much more advanced, you're going to have to do all kinds of variation and accessory work and complicated rep schemes and deloads and potential overreaching to squeeze just a few more pounds out of that individual on that squatting movement. So it's the same thing with movement patterning. You have to understand, what can I realistically accomplish? And then that gives you some guidance in terms of how hard to push an individual on that movement, because it's not necessarily about getting perfection every single day. It's about moving that person toward an ideal and then keeping them engaged and happy and motivated through that process. Because if you give them too much stuff to work on, or if you belittle them, or if you kind of, get them to think way too much about what they're doing, you may be doing more to impede their long-term progress by giving them all of this information or correcting 15 different things at once than you would by simply saying, okay, cool. Where you're at right now is here. Where I want you is here. We're going to start with this little thing. We're going to start with this breathing and bracing drill, and I want you to see if you can actually maintain that as we squat to a box, pause on the box, and then drive up. If you can get buy-in on that individual from that, and they can make progress over, let's say, 1 week or 2 weeks, then you can circle back to them and say, okay, awesome. That looks way better. What we're going to focus on now is understanding how to maintain control of your foot relative to the floor. So I want you to keep your entire foot engaged throughout the squat. We're not going to let those toes come up. We're going to drive the instep into the ground. We're going to maintain contact with both edges of the heel, and you're going to feel nice and stable on your feet as you squat. Then, once you have that established, you can reevaluate their movement, find the next piece. And this may be a process of literally months to get this person to improve their positioning. And you know what? For most people, they're never going to actually get there, that they're always going to have these default compensation patterns and these tendencies, that the best you can do as a coach is teach them to mitigate those problems over time as they start to pop up. So this prioritizing process is really, really important for giving athletes a roadmap to work on so that they feel engaged in the process, and also for you as a coach to be able to decide which things to focus on, what order to attack them in, which ones are potentially dangerous or likely to promote an injury, which flaws are not as serious and have more leeway, and how much wobble you're essentially going to allow an athlete to have as they work on improving their movement over time. So once we kind of have that piece in place, right, that's the kind of higher order coaching skill of actually prioritizing what you see and what you want to correct. We also have to do the more nebulous emotional tasks of connecting with clients. So all these details and all this knowledge and all that kind of stuff is really, really important. But I think the reality is of anyone who's been in the fitness industry with a certain amount of skill is they probably have experienced some frustration because they see coaches who seemingly don't have the ability to see, correct, and prioritize, but who are still very, very successful, who have tons of clients, who get great results from their clients, who make way more money than the average trainer. And the reality of what's going on there is that most individuals, particularly those who are signing up for coaching and all that sort of stuff, don't have the capacity to filter who is a great coach as far as seeing and correcting and prioritizing. But what they can do is they can make an emotional decision about whether or not they feel safe and connected with the coach. And that can be frustrating for someone who cares a lot about seeing, correcting, and prioritizing. But that doesn't matter, because the reality is that a lot of clients, they care about that stuff, but not that much. And even though they do care about it, they can't tell the difference too, because in order to really tell who's a great coach as far as seeing, correcting, prioritizing, all that sort of stuff, you have to sort of be one yourself, because the skills necessary to do those things are the same skills necessary to evaluate whether or not someone else is doing it effectively. So it's a pretty rare individual who has that understanding of what's going on and is going to choose their coaching based upon a concrete evaluation of their coach's skills. So what matters a lot more are things like building trust with clients, right? So we sort of talked through this in the prioritizing piece a second ago, but what we need to be able to do as coaches is get buy-in from people to a process. Most individuals have impulsive, impetuous, sort of back and forth flip-flopping ideas of what they want in the gym and what their expectations are. I think anyone who has coached for any amount of time has experienced this, where someone comes in and tells you that they want to gain 15 pounds of muscle, and you say, awesome, sounds great. We're going to do this training program. We're going to eat this many calories per day. You're going to try it out. You're going to see what happens, and we'll sort of reevaluate this every few weeks. Client starts training, starts eating a bunch of calories, actually starts gaining weight, putting on muscle. And then what do? They say, I'm really worried I'm going to get fat, right? And sure, totally valid worry to not want to put on fat mass instead of muscle mass, but clients have a poor understanding of the trade-offs required to get what they want and what that process actually looks like. So they can sort of flip-flop and be very emotional without understanding what's going on, right? Same thing in people who have potentially more performance-motivated goals. They come in, they say, hey, listen, I want to, improve my performance in the CrossFit Games Open. I want to take a shot at making it as an individual at regionals. I finished top 100 this year, and I think that I can get myself right to the edge of that bubble next year if I train super hard and sort of focus on some weaknesses. You say, sounds great. This is what we're going to do. Your biggest weakness is actually having the endurance to get through the high turnover open workouts, right? That you tend to blow up on everything. Your muscle endurance is poor, and you redline in any workout that's over 3 to 4 minutes because you don't know how to pace yourself, and you just fall apart through the end of it, but you're sort of tough enough and resilient enough that you can kind of get through it. So this is what we're going to do. We're going to improve that endurance throughout the off season so that you actually feel good and have the capacity to work hard without melting down. And then once we start to layer on some of that more nasty, difficult CrossFit stuff, the engine's going to be revving on all cylinders and you're going to kill it. So you start working on that, and then you find out that this client is pretty much unwilling to slow themselves down in their workouts and learn to pace because they feel like every single workout is a competition, and that if they're not constantly killing themselves in the gym, that they're quote unquote falling behind. So in this case, you have a problem, right? The actual training that the client needs based upon your experience as a coach is to slow down, learn to pace, build up the aerobic capacity to sustain paces at an aerobic level effort, rather than having everything sort of be an anaerobic bloodbath that sort of wipes the floor with them whenever they come in to train. But the client simply won't do it. That they have this understanding in their head of what training should feel like and how hard they need to push themselves, and potentially some other emotional issues relative to, punishing themselves and making themselves hurt all the time. And you just simply don't have buy-in from them in terms of going through that process of slowing themselves down, learning to pace, building it back up, and all that sort of thing. So what can great coaches do? Well, you can sort of think about, how do I build trust with this person so that over time I can get progress from them? And this doesn't mean necessarily being bullheaded and stubborn and rude about what you think is the correct path. Sometimes that can be valuable. Some clients simply need, an authority figure to sort of set them straight and make fun of them and tease them and not let them get away with any sort of nonsense that they're used to getting away with. Other clients, however, sort of like we talked about before, need to go through a process. They need to sort of learn how to get to that point on their own where they understand what's going on and it feels like a good idea to them, and that they sort of work through whatever potential emotional issues are keeping them from doing the right thing for them anyway, right? And that may be the client who feels like they need to work hard all the time to see improvement in the gym. That may be the client who's constantly vacillating between wanting to gain muscle mass and stay lean, and so they're sort of doing this weird dance where they won't eat enough to actually gain muscle mass, and then they are not actually trying to lose fat either, so they're just sort of like screwing around in a weird gray area in between and getting frustrated not seeing results. That a lot of the time that requires a lot of trust, and then that client working through issues on their own that really have nothing to do with you as a coach. So how can coaches do this? Well, we talked about it before, and I think that one of the most important things is for people seeing quick wins, being able to get some low-hanging fruit for them so that they start to trust the process. Because the reality is that most individuals have tried things before, right? And they may have screwed them up. This is super common. You have people come in and say, I've tried everything and I can't lose weight. And it's like, you tried two things. You tried keto and you didn't actually do it right. You didn't understand what was going on. You heard it on some podcast and you did it for 2 days, but you didn't actually do it because you weren't using keto strips and you have no idea what it means to actually be in a state of ketosis. And then you quit, and then you sort of tried counting your macros, but you didn't actually do it because you didn't weigh anything, and you have no idea how much is actually in a tablespoon of peanut butter when you legitimately weigh it on the scale. And you tried that on and off for 3 weeks without any consistency, and then you quit, and then you tried it again 3 weeks later with the same results. So I tried everything often means I tried two things and didn't actually do them. But the reality is that client feels like they've put in a lot of effort and they've gotten burned. So as a coach, your capacity to be able to create quick wins for that individual is super, super important, because then you can show them, hey, listen, if you do this, you actually have control potentially over the results that you're going to achieve. And that is one of the most powerful things for a client to understand, that their actions do matter and that they're not just constantly, swimming in a sea of snake oil and being led around by disingenuous marketing and all that sort of stuff. So another aspect that's important with that too is that you have previous coaches who have often told people things that may or may not be correct. So you as a coach also have to deal with, how do I get this person to understand what I want them to do without necessarily creating, argument or misunderstanding or all that sort of thing with sort of, concepts that are left over from previous coaches. We sort of talked about this with the back arching piece, for example. You don't want to throw previous coaches under the bus because you don't know what that coach actually said to that client. And clients often have a habit of, say they were rounding their back on their deadlift setup. The coach says, hey, listen, what I want you to do is arch your back a little bit more. We don't want you in a rounded position. That can be a little bit dangerous for you and isn't totally optimal. So give me a little bit of an arch on that and we'll see if that feels any better. Client gives them a little bit more of an arch, ends up neutral, feels good. Next thing you know, that client is just arching like crazy every time they deadlift. And, that coach initially told them the correct thing, but now this client has overcompensated in the wrong direction. So a lot of times what people have in their head are sort of the pendulum swinging way too far back and forth between disparate concepts, and the reality needs to be somewhere in the middle. So great coaches, in the process of building trust, understand how to communicate to clients in a way that they can give them this concept of the pendulum needing to swing into the right position rather than just sort of flying back and forth between two extremes. Another aspect here with building trust is just being super, super consistent with clients in terms of how you communicate with them and what your messaging is. So if you give clients, inconsistent messaging in terms of what they should be seeing on a squat, they're going to have a hard time trusting you. If they see you working with other clients and sometimes you're paying attention and are active, sometimes you're not, they're going to have a hard time trusting you. That all these things which seem almost little and ticky-tack in accumulation can make a really big difference. Because if you're giving a client pointed feedback on their squatting and it seems to the client like you're sort of targeting them and you are, being a little bit rude and impatient with them, then they can just sort of tune that out and interpret that as a personal attack rather than as you simply coaching, because that's what you do. So clients watch you all the time when you're working with them, when you're working with other people. And if you are not consistent in terms of how you behave, the things that you focus on, the way that you address people, they don't necessarily interpret your feedback as actual feedback. They'll interpret it more as an emotional story of how you relate to them and how you relate to other people. So this type of consistency and this type of integrity in terms of actually doing what you say you're going to do is really, really important for clients getting the trust in you that is necessary for them to follow what you want them to do over time. So if you're not able to get them quick wins, and if you're inconsistent in terms of how you coach people and your follow through on what you say you're going to do, they're going to have a hard time building trust with you, which means that even if you give them the perfect prescription, even if you see and correct in the right order with the right priorities, they're not necessarily going to buy in, and they're not going to do the things that they need to do, and they're not going to take the ownership that they need to take over time to actually get results. And then relative to building that trust, one of the things that I personally have had to learn and have struggled with over time has more to do with asking questions rather than being directive, right? This is funny in a podcast where I'm being very directive and telling people what I think and throwing some jokes out there and making fun of people and all that kind of stuff. But, for myself, I've often struggled with being prescriptive for people and overwhelming them with information, right? I think that everyone else wants the same level of directness and detail and information that I want, and they really don't. And then also when you throw a bunch of information at people and overwhelm them with ideas and concepts and, here's this article and you need to do it like this, and this person is totally stupid because they said this and that's wrong, that creates in a lot of people a little bit of pushback, right? Because they potentially have an idea from a previous coach, from an article that they read, from some life experience that they've had about how things work. And then when you contradict that without them sort of being open to that contradiction, what happens then is that they internally argue with that idea in their head, and you may not even recognize that, right? You're telling someone, hey, I want you to arch your back when you squat, and they're like, you know what, this Todd guy told me on his podcast that I probably don't need to arch my back that much, and you don't even understand why I'm doing that, so shut up, dude, you don't know what you're talking about. And that type of thing can be super, super toxic to a client actually buying into what you're telling them over time. So instead of always being directive and prescriptive, it's much better to ask people questions, right? And that this type of almost Socratic questioning of a client can give you a ton of insight into what is going on with them and can help you address it. And this is one of the highest order skills that I think is important for coaches, whether they're working in a one-on-one setting or in a group class setting or running programs for people or anything like that. So essentially, what needs to happen is you need to be able to see something going wrong with a client, right? Let's stick with the simple one. Let's say that they're arching their back too much on a squat. And you may come up to them, and if you just say, hey, I need you to arch your back less, they're going to tell you, they may not even tell you. They may just say in their head, screw you, dude. My previous coach told me to do this. I'm going to do it 2 times when you're watching me, so you leave me alone. I'm going to go right back to the way I'm doing it because I don't trust you. I trust my previous coach. Leave me alone. However, if you come up to them and you say, hey, listen, I see you're arching your back quite a bit when you're squatting. Tell me about that. Why are you doing that? And then they may give you an answer. They may say, well, when I was coached previously on this, I tended to round my back and my coach told me to always make sure I'm arching. Then that gives you information as a coach that you can work with, right? So now rather than being in a theoretical fake argument with their previous coach in this client's mind, you have information about what they want and what their experience is, and you can throw some information at them that is hopefully helpful. You can say, hey, listen, What I'm seeing now is that you're actually arching too much. And what your previous coach probably saw was you rounding too much. What we really need to see is something right in the middle between those two. Let's see if we can find that. Now you potentially have buy-in from that client rather than them pitting you against the previous information that they had in an argument that you don't even know that you're part of. And similarly, with more complicated behavior change issues, right? It's not enough to just give someone macros. It's not enough to just, tell them to track all their food. You have to actually follow up with them and understand why they're doing what they're doing and what's going on. So, this is something that happens all the time. Someone says, okay, cool, I'm trying to follow macros. This is what I'm doing. And you may see a bunch of problems with their food log, right? It's super inaccurate. It's very inconsistent. They're not getting enough protein and they eat out several times a week. And for you as a coach, it's really easy to potentially list all of those problems. And for some percentage of clients, they just want the information. They just want you to tell them what to do. They're going to go and execute it. But for most people, what needs to happen instead is you need to understand what's going on in their life and their specific situation so you can make targeted recommendations that actually empower them. And then oftentimes these recommendations work a lot better if the client comes up with it on their own. So let's take the example of someone, with all those food log problems. You may say to them, okay, I see a bunch of these problems and here's the 15 things you need to do to fix it. Good luck. That's not going to go too well for you or the client, right? They're probably going to get overwhelmed and quit and feel like you don't understand them and that you're just giving them sort of like a high horse prescription. It's like, oh yeah, sure, you genetically talented trainer who lives in the gym. Like, here's all the stuff that I should do. Well, screw you. I'm not doing it because I have a real life and a real job and a family and I like having fun and you're just some loser who eats out of Tupperware. Leave me alone. What you potentially need to be able to do is ask that client what's going on with them. So a good question to ask is potentially, what meal do you have the most control over, right? That gives you an in to be able to understand where that client has stress, where that client has control, where they can actually take charge of what they're doing, say in the kitchen or with their grocery shopping. And then you can help them come up with ideas. So say you want them to eat more protein. Cool. Which meal do you have the most control over? You don't know what it is. For you, it may be breakfast, right? For you, it may be lunch. For you, it may be dinner, but you don't know what that client's situation is. Maybe they rush out the door every single morning and they're always late to work. Or maybe they consistently have catering at lunch at work and they would be feeling awkward and left out if they didn't participate in that meal with their coworkers. Or they may have a crazy family life after work where they're rushing around and picking kids up from various activities and they just need to grab something on the go so that they're not starving at the end of the night. And then based upon all those factors, that there may be one meal that they actually do have control over, and it may not be the one you think. So you want to ask them, which meal do you have control over? Then based upon that, you can say, okay, cool. Let's try to get more protein in this meal. What is something that could make sense for you? And then the client may have some ideas. They may say, oh, maybe I'll eat some hard-boiled eggs. Or like, oh, I can make this like oatmeal with protein powder. Like they might give you something that makes a lot of sense. And you say, cool, that sounds good. Let's try it. Or they may not know. And that's where your guidance as a coach can come in, right? If they're at the point where they're saying, you know what, I have control over breakfast. I generally have a little bit of time before I have to catch the train. But I've sort of just eat this because this is what I've always eaten. Do you have any recommendations? Now the client is asking you rather than you telling them. And then based upon that, they're much more likely to actually take your recommendations. So you could say, hey, listen, how do you feel about hard-boiled eggs? And they might say, I find them to be disgusting and slimy, and I have a negative association with them because, I was force-fed hard-boiled eggs by the schoolyard bully during my lunch period as a second grader, and I vomited in front of everyone, so I will never eat a hard-boiled egg ever again in my life. And then based upon that, you're going to say, cool, let's not eat hard-boiled eggs. Let's find something else. What is another idea that you have that works for you? And that might give you something. So once you have that ability to ask questions, to get feedback from people and understand where they're at, then you as a coach can utilize all the different tools that you have in your toolbox. You can ask them, how does that movement feel, right? They may tell you, it doesn't feel so good when they're doing some crazy nonsense as they row. And then you have an in to say, okay, cool. Well, do you want to work on it? Yeah, sure. I've always had trouble with rowing. It kind of hurts my back and I know I'm not going as fast as I could. All right, awesome. Let's try this. But if you don't understand that the client is doing some crazy rowing technique because they feel like their hips hurt them when they row the quote unquote proper way, then you're just going to give them a recommendation that they're going to do 2 times when you're looking at them and they're going to throw away once you turn your back because they don't feel like you actually understand them. So this process of asking questions and getting feedback and then utilizing that to give clients what they actually need in the moment based upon where they're at, I think is one of the highest order and most important aspects of coaching. And it sort of ties everything else together, right? If you can ask questions to get people to give you the right information relative to what they're thinking, then you can do all the other stuff. Then you can throw the tools and tricks and tips and all those sorts of things that you know, right, from your ability to see and correct, from your ability to prioritize their different issues, and your ability to sort of see where they're at and where they want to go. Once you ask the right questions and you actually build trust with them, then you can throw that forward into their actual training program and their actual recommendations that you're giving them, and they're going to follow through on it with much greater consistency. And all that's to say, that doesn't mean that clients are going to actually do what you want them to consistently. A lot of the times they're not. And then what does that process look like? Well, it looks like the process we just talked about. You say, hey, listen, like we talked about this before. I gave you this recommendation. It seemed to go well, and it's not going as well right now. Tell me about that. What's going on? Why have you struggled to eat the hard-boiled eggs we talked about? It looks like you're still arching your back a whole ton when you squat. Tell me about that. What's the deal? And they may tell you that they simply just didn't do it. They may tell you, you know what? I tried it your way and it didn't work. I felt like that hurt my hips. Okay, awesome. Let's try messing with your stance. Let's try having you squat to a box. They may tell you that their nutrition plan was super chaotic because they had family in town and they were busy at work, and you say, awesome. Maybe the most important thing for us isn't to work on actually getting you to eat these specific numbers of protein for your breakfast. Maybe it's for you to understand what your plan B is when you get stressed and busy. That all these processes really require constant iteration. And if you have trust from the client and they're bought in, and you just keep asking questions, then you can actually use the tools that you have to help them. And the reality is that there's some clients who you're never going to get trust from, and that may not be something that you can control. You may not be a good fit for them as a coach, or they may have some other issue going on that's simply going to preclude them from actually fully participating in what you guys are trying to do. In that case, that's okay too. You can help them as much as you have the ability to do so, but it's not always your obligation as a coach to save everybody. And you have to be able to sort of recognize when you've reached the limit of what you can accomplish, and either tell someone, hey, listen, there might be a better fit for you, or I'm happy to keep working with you, but I notice that these things are potentially getting in the way. If you never send me your programming results, I can't update your program for you. And it's okay if you want me to keep writing you stuff, but just know that it's going to have way less impact than it could potentially have over time if you fully engage in the process. And you can empower the client to make the decision that they want to make, or you as a coach may simply say, you know what, I can really only work with 10 people at a time. And based upon that, I need to actually maximize the time that I'm spending. And if you're not fully invested in this process, it doesn't make sense for me to spend time doing it with you. I'd rather use some of my limited time and attention with someone who is fully invested. Let me know what you want to do. And that kind of conversation can be kind of blunt and brutal, but it can also be very effective when you have sort of created this trust with someone, and they've also seen you consistently behave in this manner with all kinds of individuals who you work with, whether that's them or someone else. So to kind of sum up, we have the table stakes for coaching. That's that seeing and correcting capacity, the ability to see what's going wrong with someone's behavior or someone's movement relative to a potentially idealized version. Then the ability to understand what type of correction they potentially need, right? To prioritize those corrections and those flaws. What is going to be the highest leverage? What is going to potentially cause other downstream flaws to improve? And then the individual relationship aspect of building trust with people, understanding what is realistic for them over time so that you can give them quick wins to get buy-in from them, and then you can find an actual trajectory that makes sense that they're going to see progress on, and then the ability to ask questions of them that helps you understand where they're at and what they're thinking, so that you're not simply throwing down dictates from on high and very prescriptive ideas of what they should be doing that aren't realistic for them, that simply cause them to kind of tune you out and lose buy-in. Thanks for listening all the way through. I admire your grit, your persistence, and your perseverance. Since you made it, I have a few favors to ask of you. Go ahead and open up the show notes on whatever podcast player you use. In there, you'll find links to all the resources that were mentioned throughout the show. There's also some links there in which you can leave a review or subscribe to the show. And podcasters are always harping on this because this actually makes a difference in terms of the algorithms that recommend podcasts to new people. So if you do that, it helps more people find the show. And if you head over to toddneef.com, you can sign up to receive most of my thoughts and writing, which really only go out to the email list. A lot of it never makes it to the blog or the podcast. So if you like what I have to say and you want to see some of my recommendations and stuff that I've been checking out, go ahead and subscribe to that email newsletter as well.